Let's go now and do the first part, which is the runner part of the model. So our runner part of the model is going to have just a name and an email address for now. And so the way that we do this is we define a variable called name and set it equal to something that's built into the Google App Engine superclass. And the name will be a string, and so we're going to say db.string property. This is what enables us to create essentially a field or column, you can think about it, in our model. Similarly, our email address is also going to be a string property. All right, that's all we have to do. That's the smallest thing that we have to do to create our runner. Now let's add a runner handler. So just like our other handlers, we'll make a get method. And what we want to do is get the URL parameters and use those URL parameters to create an instance of a runner. So we can get create a local variable called name, which we access through the by calling this get method to access the URL parameter that we'll call name. And this will enable us to call the runner function, and we'll pass it a name and email address through the URL parameters, just like we've done in the past with the dictionary. Once we've accessed this information, we can go ahead and create a new runner. And runner is a class, so we make a new one just like we do any other way. We don't actually have to pass in any parameters. When we create it, it has no parameters, right? Up here when we define this, this is not a parameter, this is the name of the superclass. All right, now we can go ahead and set its properties. So its name is going to be the local variable name, and its email will be the local variable email. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a special put method which will now save this into the database. And that's it. We should be ready to go with the basics of this. Let's go ahead back to our App Engine launcher and run this. Okay, wait till this turns green, and now we can try looking at this on port 8080. Of course, all we've done is created a URL called add runner, which takes parameters which we can add into the database. So we'll say question mark name equals Ben Peterson and email equals, here's my real email address, betterson@gmail.com. Press return. Okay, well, I don't know. Maybe it worked, right? All we did is we accessed this URL, which should have gone in our code, right? It'll use this lookup table to say that when you call add runner, it'll call the add runner handler. It'll use this get method. It'll do all this and add this to the database, but we didn't return anything. We didn't do any calls to self-response, right? So we don't know if this succeeded. So how do we know if this is written into the database? Well, it turns out if we go back to Google App Engine Launcher, you may have noticed there's some other buttons here, and one of them is the SDK console. Take a look at this, and this turns out gives us access to all kinds of interesting things, including the data store viewer. And when we look in this, we will see, in fact, that the data store is completely empty. Well, that means that something went wrong. So now we have an opportunity to debug, right? Our program didn't give us any feedback. We look at our source code. Well, we think it works. There is something suspicious here because we've got this red squiggly. Maybe you recognize what's wrong with it. I actually didn't know what it was at first, but now I know what it is, so see if you can figure it out. But there's one other thing we can do. Let's go back to the Google App Engine Launcher, and there's something else called logs. And logs gives us a list, essentially, of this is essentially our web server, and this gives us our web logs. In fact, the successful ones look a lot like what you saw in Homework 9 when you did your web log parsing. But if there's any errors in the Python, this is where the errors will come up. And so we can see that there was a request for get/add_runner, right? That's what we had asked for in the web browser. And we got a traceback. We got a Python error. And if we scroll down to the bottom, we'll see what happened. And it said syntax error on line 18, google.appengine.ext import db. And it's like, why is there a syntax error? Look more closely, and it's like, of course there's a syntax error. You can't just say google.appengine.ext. You either have to import it or you have to say from. And that's why we're having that error. So our code executed, but it didn't know how to access Google, and so we that package, and so we ran into a problem. Let's go back to our web browser. We'll refresh this URL page. That's this URL is going to do our database add. And this time we got a different error, 404, resource could not be found. 404 is the HTTP status code response that says the URL you've requested doesn't exist. So why doesn't it exist? We must have a typo in here, because if we look at our source code, it's very clear that we have correctly mapped /add_runner to this handler. So we know that we can respond to the URL add runner. So what do we got here? We've got a domain localhost, port 8080, and then after the slash is add runner, then slash, and then question mark followed by our URL parameters. So this is all URL parameters. That's correct. Add runner is correct. So the only thing that's questionable is this slash right here. And it turns out that's the error. By putting a slash here, what we're really doing is saying, give me the page inside this directory add runner, or it'll look for index.html in the directory add runner, and that doesn't exist. Remember, that's what happens if you add a slash at the end. It looks for index.html in that directory. Instead, we actually want the URL add runner. So it was a mistake to have that slash. So go ahead and remove that slash, load this page. Now we got no errors. We can go back to our data store viewer, refresh, fingers crossed, and look at this. It now says there is an entity kind of runner. In other words, we have a instance of a class model runner, and this is the list of entities. It's got a key. This is that built-in ID that I mentioned. It's built-in is actually over here, and there's a key that concludes the ID. It's got some other information, key name, but finally here is the name Ben Peterson. Okay, there doesn't seem to be any email, so we seem to have done something else wrong. So let's go ahead and look back at our request. We've got name equals. Notice when we refreshed, it turned our space character into a HTTP version of space, which is %20. So that's actually a special code for space characters. You'll sometimes see that. And email equals the rest of this. That looks okay. Go back to our request here. And we got the email, set that all up. And it turns out if we look at runner, we had left off some parentheses here, and that's why email wasn't working. Let's go ahead and load this again. Okay, go to our data store viewer, refresh, and now the second one not only has Ben Peterson and the email, but it also shows how we dynamically changed the schema, right? The first time we wrote to this, it had one schema, just a name, and the second time it had a different schema, name and email. We can actually do some manipulation of the database through this user interface. We can delete that bad one. Go ahead and delete that. And if you click on the key, you actually get a UI where you can modify some of this. So let's just go and change this to my full name, Benjamin B. Save this, and now in our database we've got this full one. Great. Let's just go ahead and prove this works. Let's add talk. It's my other example. Talk Yon Lee. And I'll just make up an email from him. Talk. Load that. Go to our data store viewer. Refresh. And now we have a second entry in the data store viewer, really a second instance of this entity. So we've got our runner model set up.